What's up, squad? This is Brandon from the Bantu Sun. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, I said I was going to keep everybody posted as I research for my next product around Australia and Oceania, the islands of the Mid and South Pacific. And today I came on to a very interesting topic during my research that I wanted to share with you. So, when you're dealing with islands in these regions, it's primarily uh, broke off in three categories, which I think is might be erroneous. At the furthermore I dive into this, because it is around race primarily, as opposed to other factors, which are far more indicative of the ethnicity of a people. And I'm starting to think that race is a very fluid term that we have a modern obsession with. So because of that obsession, you have to respect the space in the room. But for actual deductive reasoning, we have to properly categorize that. Now, these three categories are going to be based in Greek words. It's going to be Micronesia. These are going to be the more northern islands. Uh, Primarily small island, micro meaning small, right? Melanesians, the land of the dark skinned people, or the islands of the dark skinned people. These are your lower mid tier islands, geographically speaking. I'm speaking of latitude. Your Solomon Islands, your Fiji, and then you're gonna go down further and wider. You have your Polynesian islands, your Togos, your or New Zealand or Samoa. So these terms, I think, are really way too linked closely to race than what we're really trying to get at. And that is an understanding of a people and history and cause and effect, right? So I'm wanting to dig into that a little bit with you today to share this experience of the research. As I say, when I'm making my products, it's not about just creating hotspots or fun places to visit and putting it on a map, but I'm really trying to communicate the culture, the history, the essence of a people in my product, so that as you use it as a learning tool, the information you receive is going to be functional and things you can use to make real world deductive analysis from. So what I did today is I doing something a little different that I want to do a lot more often as well, because I live on a map. So I want to pull out the maps today. And what I want to do is I want to turn the camera around and we can start digging into the conversation of why I think the conversation of race is so, I don't want to say goofy, but what it is, it's definitely, let's say, a red herring. It's a misdirection play of what's really going on. And although you can have an appreciation of it, there also needs to be a respect for the total picture of what's really going on. What do I mean by that? So this map right here, I think it's best to start off with the general landscape, top down. Where are we beginning at? And this is considered the Great Migration out of Africa. It is widely believed, nobody was there, but it is widely believed, nobody alive now at least, it is widely believed that the original mankind, originated from sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I've heard various degrees on this, but this map does a great way of basically dismissing this argument. Some people would say East Africa. I've heard some people even go as far as saying Southern Africa. Although we don't know specifically where modern humankind begins, we can roughly say somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, which is going to be the red filled-in area right here. Now, this map has 130,000 years ago this migration began. I've seen numbers as high as 200,000 years ago. Nevertheless, this map does a great job of giving you a general direction of how the world was populated by modern man. And as you can see, it comes out of sub-Saharan Africa into the Middle East about 100,000 years ago. It then begins to go east. And that eastern branch break up. We have a line going to Central and Northern Asia. We have groups going down in the subcontinent. And we have groups flowing all the way out to we land in Australia, the South Pacific. And of course, we can't forget At a later date, the migration breakout into Europe. Now, chronology is the clues of history, right? It's the fingerprints of history. So, what we can tell based off these approximate dates was the populating um, timeline from far out Australia is roughly in line with the population of Europe. And I think that's going to be for various reasons, mainly climate change as well. Maybe the opportunity to go into Europe wasn't present prior to this time frame, but it also speaks to the young nature of Europe. So Europe is saying populated around 40,000 years ago, and Australia 40 to 60,000, roughly 50,000 years ago. Now, going back to our conversation in the breakout of race, so Micronesia is going to be roughly around here, Melanesia is going to be around here, and Polynesian is going to be around here. Now, these groups are all considered to be part of a broad term called Austronesians. And I really want to dive into them in my product because I think Austronesians are probably the greatest, maybe the greatest mariners in history, in particular the Polynesian. If you look at the Pacific, the world's largest ocean, it's so much water. Now you have little specks of land there, but the navigation it took to sail these islands during this time was absolutely phenomenal. So it wasn't always this way. So around this time, you get this migration of going into Australia, modern day Aborigines. You can see that the land was broken out into two landmass, and this map does a really good job of separating those landmass, right? Sunda and Sahul. Now, the darker colors give you a rough outline of what the landmass would have looked like around that 50,000 years ago timeline. And you have Australia as well. And as you can see, Papua is connected to Australia, or the islands of modern day Papua New Guinea. New Guinea is connected to Australia, and Australia is connected to Tasmania, which means that you can travel by land, and it wasn't much, I don't want to say effort, but it wasn't an extreme degree of risk to travel. You're probably inside of land most of this time. It's no extreme degree of risk to travel from Sunda to Sahul. This is where the indigenous Australians, the route they are believed to have taken, coming down, as you can see in the prior map, going through Southeast Asia, making their way down to Australia. And they were able to do that by more or less land with some sea interaction. Now, this is where we get into the conversation of the Austronesians. So the Austronesians, this is Southeast Asia right there. The Austronesians are roughly considered to have migrated starting in East Asia, modern day Taiwan, or Philippines, depending on when you want to start your timeline, which was, this has us at 800 years later, but if you zoom in, you'll see it starts around coming down around 3000 BC, right? Now you have to remember, when was this region first migrated to? Around 60 to 70,000 years ago in Australia. Like, this is massive time gap. This is a massive time gap. This is about 50,000 years, rough estimation. So this group comes down, or I want to say these groups come down, and I think that's important. And you can see it starts to migrate, and it leads to some pretty interesting reflections. This purple is going to identify the Melanesians, the yellow Micronesia, and the green, the Polynesian group. And as you can see, the Polynesians up here is Hawaii. Down here to the south is New Zealand. And all the way out here is Easter Island. That is a massive, now Easter Island is a part of Chile. This is a massive gap to span. This section alone is massive. It shows the extent of the maritime skill of these Polynesian groups. Now, what I want to call out is many speak of these groups as distinctive, but from my research and where my gut is telling me is these are one people, and what really separates them is the chronology of when they came. Most of Indonesian was around over 1,000 years ago, and you see a rough timeline where it goes there for Melanesia, and less of or shorter mid-level timeline with Micronesia. And the Polynesians, some of these dates are even AD. The Polynesians are the youngest of the group. And what they try to do is separate, and this is why I don't like this classification of Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. I get what they're trying to do, but it's I don't know, it's too blunt of an object. You can narrow this down a little bit more. Um, what's important to understand is I think is during this migration, these are not blunt points in time. This is a flow. It's continual migration, just like all of human history. This continuous flows of migration. This isn't a migration route. This is a migration flow. And populations, even though it may start 130,000 years ago, are still flowing. We haven't even talked about the modern European populations that came out of the North Caucasus 5,000 years ago, which primarily dominate the land. We're just talking about the first wave here. And I think that's what's happening here. You have this first wave of people coming in, but it's still people coming in. And which makes me believe that the original wave was melanated. And over time, and they said the last ice age, which we still are having consequences of global warming, occurred roughly around 11, 12,000 years ago. So what you have is this ice age, the water melts, and what happens? All of these, the darker colors turn into water, and migration flows end up becoming isolated, which is why you'll get the indigenous aborigines trapped in Australia, and the Melanesians trapped on their islands as well. What happened is the sea level rose, and it wasn't as easy to cross by land. The big continents didn't have this issue, so you still see migration and integration, such as the Bantu migration in Africa, right? And just like any migration, some groups stayed and some group and assimilated with newcomers, and some groups exited and they wanted to get away. And I think that's really what's occurring here. And as they say, this is going to be validated by the DNA. Polynesian DNA is not so prevalent within the Melanesia Islands. And it's because it's a fast boat theory, a idea that they came through so fast through these islands because they were eager to get out to here. Now, what motivated these people, I have no idea yet, but they were motivated to take these risks and to continue on, just as these Austronesians, the greater group of these people, were able and motivated to leave out of mainland Asia. The other thing I wanted to identify is you can see this breakout to the east, 500 AD to Madagascar. So for those that have my Africa product, you know that the indigenous people of Madagascar were not Bantus, but they are considered Malagasy people. They are considered, their language there, their history is Austronesian. And I found that to be really interesting that of all the islands that I looked at around sub-Saharan Africa primarily, I wasn't able to find one already populated by indigenous sub-Saharan Africans, whether that's St. Helena, whether that's Madagascar, Comoros, Seychelles, Mauritius. These islands, from my research, were uninhabited. So this speaks again to why I separate Melanesians and wouldn't necessarily put them into an Africa category, just like I wouldn't put indigenous Australian between an African category. There is a distinct difference between Black, which I think is a very dismissive word. It removes the culture, the history, the DNA, the diet, all these things that truly make up the being of a modern day person for something that, for race, which I think is replaceable within a few generations. So, and I think the reason why the Melanesians kept that color is because as these Austronesian people came down, they assimilated with the darker skinned groups. Whereas coming from a higher climate, these were probably more fair skinned people, and the ones that continued out did not stay as long. And another point to pick up on this, and this is reflected in domestication of animals as well. When you see Europeans coming to this region, you see a significant population drop down, with the most egregious example being the indigenous Tasmanians, who are almost considered, I think it would be fair to say, extinct, right? There are no more indigenous Tasmanians, and they were wiped out by the diseases, just as similar as the indigenous people of the Americas was. You don't see this widespread depletion of populations when you go farther up north, where it's more likely that the Austronesians populated. And I think that because some of these people, a lot of these groups, they brought wild animals, and a lot of the diseases can be basically tied back to domestication of wild animals, which happened significantly later than when these groups came out. Like domestication of wild animals probably go back 10,000 years, and you have these groups coming down here 50,000 years ago. So to me, this is a little spread out, highly complex, of course, and I'm obviously offering a gross simplification of things. But I think these are the details and the conversations that are very important to have, and understanding the complexity, history, and identity of any people and culture in the modern day society that we navigate. So, time, I really appreciate you sent to that conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Was I dead on, or did I go way left somewhere? So appreciate you for joining. Until next time, take care. Bantu up.